My name is Kendall. I grew up in Milwaukee in a family where responsibility wasn't discussed, it was assigned. For years, it was understood that I would fill in whatever needed to be covered. Bills, errands, favors, last-minute emergencies. No one ever said thank you. They just acted like it was my role by default. It happened over dinner. Nothing dramatic on the surface. My dad placed his fork down and looked directly at me. His tone was steady, almost casual when he said, "You will handle the mortgage payment this month. If you can't, don't come home for Christmas." There was no pause to consider how it sounded. Just certainty. I asked, "Why is it always me?" My sister Brooke, who has never once had to carry the weight of a bill or responsibility without someone cushioning the impact for her, let out a short laugh. Not from humor. A laugh used to dim someone else's feelings. My mother told me I was overreacting, that in families everyone contributes. But we all knew who had been contributing steadily, quietly, year after year. No one raised their voice. The room remained calm. Yet everything in me shifted. It was not a request. It was an expectation so ingrained, they didn't even see it as something worth questioning. Before I continue, tell me what time it is where you are and which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Later that night, once the house had settled into its usual quiet, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen lit the room with a pale glow, steady and calm, which felt nothing like the dinner we had just shared. I signed into the online banking portal first. The accounts listed my name alongside my parents'. These accounts had once been described as symbols of trust, something shared for the good of the household. Over time, they had become pipelines through which my paycheck disappeared without acknowledgment. I opened the settings menu and began removing my authorization. The process required several confirmations, re-entry of passwords, and identity checks, though none of it felt complicated. I had done this many times in different contexts while managing other responsibilities for the family. The familiarity made everything feel strangely routine rather than dramatic. I exported the statements before I logged out, storing them neatly in a folder labeled Records. I had no intention of arguing about what I had done later. I simply wanted everything to be clear, traceable, and professional. Next, I accessed the mortgage autopay account. My name had been used to set up the recurring payments, which meant the withdrawals came directly from my income, even though the property did not belong to me. I clicked into the scheduling tab and canceled the next payment. There were warning prompts asking if I was sure, noting that cancellation might lead to penalties. I confirmed without hesitation. The responsibility no longer belonged to me. I did not feel relief or triumph, only clarity. I moved on to the warehouse system login that connected to the building my great-aunt Margaret, whom we all called Maggie, had left to my parents to manage. I had been the one overseeing supply intake, storage reports, and inventory accuracy for years because I was the only one who handled details carefully. I downloaded all current records, organized them in one clean final report, then removed my user credentials. The system asked if I wanted to leave a note for the next administrator. I typed a short message: "Access has been transferred. Relevant records are attached. No accusations, no commentary, only facts." Email came last. I composed 3 separate messages, each brief and neutral. One to my father, one to my mother, one to Brooke. The messages were identical except for their names. I wrote, "I have removed my access from all shared accounts and systems. Future responsibilities should be reassigned." I did not elaborate. I did not ask for understanding. I did not offer explanation. I sent each email, closed the application, and shut my laptop. Before going to bed, I changed every password I owned. I added 2-factor authentication where it had not existed before. I deleted old recovery contacts. The actions were orderly, almost rhythmic, and the room stayed still the entire time. There was no trembling or hesitation. I had expected anger or grief to rise in me, yet what I felt was simply steadiness. a quiet that had been missing for years. When I finally lay down, the house was silent. I listened to my own breathing, even and calm. No one knew yet. No one had begun calling or messaging. The consequences had not started. They would arrive soon, but not tonight. Tonight there was only the knowledge that I had stepped out of a role I had never agreed to hold. I closed my eyes and slept without interruption. The next morning arrived quietly, though the calm did not last long. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when the family group chat lit up with message after message. The screen filled with capital letters, notifications appearing faster than I could watch them arrive. The first ones came from my father. He demanded to know what I had done to the accounts. His tone was clipped full of the authority he always reached for when control began to slip. He insisted that my decision was irresponsible and said that I was jeopardizing the stability of the household. He wrote long paragraphs explaining how families depended on contribution and reliability, as if I needed a lecture on commitment after years of being the one who carried more weight than anyone else. My mother joined in moments later, but her approach was different. Instead of focusing on rules and logistics, she shifted into emotional pressure. She told me she was disappointed and hurt, that the timing was cruel, that I must not understand how strained things had been for them recently. She said she felt as if I was tearing the family apart. There was something almost rehearsed in the way she appealed to guilt, as though she had used these techniques many times and believed they would continue to work. I recognized each pattern as it appeared familiar in the worst way. Then Brooke stepped in. Her messages lacked structure and came in short, pointed bursts. She accused me of wanting attention, of creating drama, of choosing a moment right before the holidays, because I wanted to make everything about myself. She told me I enjoyed disrupting the peace, that I had always needed things to feel difficult. None of her messages surprised me. She had spent years convinced that her comfort was the default state of our family, and that anything which changed it had to be someone else's fault. The idea that I might act to protect my own boundaries did not fit the story she preferred to believe. I read every message without responding. The silence felt steady, a deliberate choice rather than an absence. I did not defend myself, explain what I had done, or attempt to soften the consequences. Each time my phone vibrated, I placed it face down and returned to what I was doing. The lack of reaction from me created a new tone in the chat. Their messages became fragmented, uncertain, less controlled. The conversation shifted from accusation to confusion. Later that morning, messages began arriving from suppliers who worked with the business. They were asking who would now be overseeing purchase orders, inventory logs, and payment scheduling. Some of them assumed there had been a mistake in the system because they no longer had access to the contact portals I used to maintain. Others simply sounded cautious, sensing a disruption, but unsure whether to acknowledge it directly. Their questions made it clear that my role had never been small or replaceable, no matter how little credit had been given to me in the past. Around noon, I received a different kind of message. It was an email from the building administration of the warehouse where my parents leased storage space for the shop. The subject line referenced an upcoming lease review and included my name among the required attendees. I recognized the signature at the bottom of the email immediately. It belonged to Margaret Hale, my great-aunt, though most people in the family called her Maggie. She owned the property and had always been careful in how she interacted with our side of the family. Her involvement meant that whatever was happening was already beginning to extend beyond an argument inside a group chat. People who had real influence in the business were now paying attention. I did not respond to the email right away. I simply closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment. The morning had unfolded exactly as I expected. The storm was beginning, and I remained still at the center of it. That afternoon, I arrived at the leasing office with a folder of documents tucked under my arm. The weather outside was cold enough that every breath felt sharp, but my focus was steady as I stepped into the building. I checked in at the front desk and waited in a small lobby that looked out over the city skyline. The receptionist called my name and led me to a meeting room with glass walls and a long wooden table. I took a seat and placed the folder in front of me, waiting. The door opened and Margaret Hale, the property manager who handled all commercial leases in the building, walked in. She was known simply as Maggie among tenants, though her reputation suggested that familiarity never made her any less precise. She greeted me with a polite nod, sat down, and folded her hands on the table. Her expression was calm, professional, unreadable. There was no warmth, no hostility, simply attention. She began by reviewing the documents I had brought. I handed her the most recent operational logs, expense records, vendor invoices, and maintenance schedules arranged chronologically and labeled clearly. She took her time examining each section, occasionally asking for clarification, though her tone never implied judgment. She was gathering facts, not stories. I answered concisely and let the documents speak for themselves. Once she finished reviewing the material, she opened a copy of the lease agreement that the business operated under. The lease had been signed under one primary operator, which legally placed responsibility for management decisions under that individual. It also contained clauses regarding unauthorized delegation of operational authority. Maggie pointed to the section that outlined the tenant's obligation to notify management of any changes in control, decision-making authority, or primary financial responsibility. Her fingertip rested lightly on the page. She asked when the shift in internal control had taken place. I told her the date and provided a record that confirmed when my access privileges had been assumed and redistributed without a formal amendment to the lease. There was a brief pause while she scanned the timestamp. The silence in the room was steady, but it did not feel tense. It felt procedural. She looked up and stated that the situation constituted a lease compliance violation. Her voice was even measured. She explained that the next step according to policy was to issue a notice to cure, giving the tenant a defined period to restore operational oversight in accordance with the contract. There was no accusation, no reprimand, just the process. I acknowledged her statement. She began drafting the notice, immediately typing with deliberate keystrokes. When she finished, she printed the form, signed it, and slid it across the table. I read it carefully. The notice detailed the exact violation, the timeline for resolution, and the potential consequences if it was not corrected. It did not mention emotion, intent, or personal dynamics. It only cited terms, dates, and obligations. Maggie asked if I had any questions. I did not. She reminded me that the notice was standard procedure and that the building's responsibility was to maintain contractual integrity. She did not attempt to offer comfort. She did not express opinion. Her clarity was its own form of respect. We stood. She shook my hand. Her posture and expression remained composed. As I left the office, I understood that something fundamental had shifted. The situation was no longer a private family conflict. It had entered the realm of documented accountability. There would be records. There would be deadlines. There would be outcomes. There was no turning back to how things had been. One day later, I arrived at the conference room on the second floor of the leasing building 20 minutes before the scheduled time. The room was quiet except for the hum of ventilation. I set my bag on the table and placed a notepad in front of me. I did not expect to take many notes. I simply wanted to be prepared. The door remained open and footsteps echoed in the hallway before anyone appeared. My parents entered together, followed by Brooke, who crossed her arms immediately after sitting down. Their expressions carried frustration and certainty, although neither emotion seemed rooted in understanding. They positioned themselves across from me in a line as if presenting a united front. No one greeted me. I did not greet them either. Silence filled the room like a neutral witness. A few moments later, Maggie walked in. Her movements were steady and composed. She sat at the head of the table and opened a folder that contained the notice to cure as well as a highlighted copy of the lease. There was no ceremony to her actions. Everything had purpose. She began by summarizing the situation in the same neutral tone I had heard in our previous meeting. The explanation was clear and direct. The lease required that any change to primary operational authority be formally disclosed. That disclosure had not occurred. Therefore, the contract was in violation. My father attempted to interrupt, insisting that everything within the business was a family matter. He leaned forward, speaking as though authority alone could alter written terms. Maggie listened without expression and then reiterated that the lease did not concern internal family dynamics. It concerned legal responsibility and regulatory compliance. Personal relationships had no bearing on contractual obligations. Her tone remained professional, unshaken. My mother shifted strategies. Her voice softened as she suggested that the situation must be a misunderstanding or the result of miscommunication. She implied that I could easily clear things up by explaining that the business decisions were shared. Maggie did not adjust her expression. She pointed to the signature line that designated a single responsible operator. The text was clear. Ownership of emotion did not change recorded agreements. Brooke leaned back in her chair and spoke with impatience, claiming that I was doing this out of spite, or to make a point. She insisted that I must have wanted attention. I let her words fall without response. Maggie continued speaking as though Brooke had not spoken at all. The conversation belonged to the contract, not to interpretation or accusation. My parents then turned to me directly. The tone changed from persuasion to instruction. They told me that I needed to resume operational oversight so the violation could be corrected and the business could continue. Their phrasing did not suggest a request. It suggested expectation, obligation, inevitability. The assumption had always been that I would do what was needed regardless of fairness. I looked at them and spoke only once. My voice was calm and steady. I said that I was no longer participating in the business. There was no argument in my tone, no attempt to convince anyone of anything. I stated it as a fact that did not require approval. The room fell quiet. My father searched for control through volume, but the impact was absent. My mother looked toward Maggie, hoping the situation could still be redirected. Maggie noted that without an operator in place, she would proceed to temporarily suspend warehouse access until compliance could be restored. She documented the action clearly and moved the paperwork toward the center of the table. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments, no shift in understanding. 3 days later, I was at my apartment when the first ripple of consequences reached me through email. A client who had signed a staging agreement for a property in Wauwatosa sent a formal message withdrawing from the contract. The tone of the email was polite, even apologetic, but it was clear that the cancellation came from uncertainty rather than inconvenience. Without a designated operational authority, the staging work could not move forward under valid business insurance or access permissions. I read the message slowly and closed the laptop for a moment. The business had begun to loosen from its structure. By midday, another message arrived from one of the larger inventory suppliers. They requested payment upfront for the next order of furniture pieces. The phrasing was firm but not aggressive. They had heard somehow that the warehouse access was currently restricted, and the business was undergoing an internal transition. Without predictable oversight, suppliers required security. This meant that the flow of income would reverse before it could stabilize. The business no longer had a consistent pipeline of revenue to offset expenses. I understood the implications immediately and did not need to calculate beyond that. My phone rang in the afternoon, though I did not answer at first. When I eventually listened to the voicemail, my father's voice was strained and uneven. He spoke about what the cancellations would mean, how work schedules had already been planned, and how clients were expecting results. There was no recognition of the conditions that led to this moment, only urgency, frustration, and an insistence that I could still undo the situation if I wanted to. The call ended without a request. It ended as if the expectation remained unchanged. A little later, my mother texted. Her messages were longer, softer, and filled with references to stress, exhaustion, and fear of losing stability. She described how difficult everything had become for her and how she felt as though she was carrying more than she could manage. The narrative placed her at the center of strain, while the cause of that strain was positioned just out of frame. I read the messages without responding. My silence did not come from anger. It came from clarity. That evening, the situation shifted to a public stage. Brooke posted a long message on both her Instagram and Facebook accounts. The tone of her words was emotional, and the story she constructed positioned herself and my parents as victims of betrayal. She wrote that I had abandoned the family in pursuit of my own advantage, that I cared more about control than loyalty, and that I had chosen to walk away when my family needed me most. The post received comments within minutes. Some expressed sympathy. Some encouraged her. A few questioned the situation, though their voices were small among the others. Friends and relatives began reaching out. Some messaged to confirm whether what they had read was true. Some sent short, disappointed statements. Some said nothing but watched, which was its own form of participation. I did not reply to any of them. I did not write a response, a correction, or a justification. Speaking into noise would not create understanding. It would only create more noise. That night, Nathan stopped by briefly. He had heard about the situation from mutual acquaintances and wanted to make sure I was not isolated in it. He did not offer solutions or strategies. He did not ask me to reconsider anything. He only sat with me for a while and listened, which required no decisions. When he left the room, felt steady, rather than empty. I remained quiet. The consequences were unfolding in the direction they had always been moving. I did not need to guide them. I only needed to let them become visible. 1 week later, the certified envelope arrived at my apartment door with the same quiet finality as a door closing. I already knew what it would contain before I opened it, because the situation had reached a point where every outcome followed a logic that no longer surprised me. The notice stated clearly that the warehouse lease was being terminated. It referenced provisions in the contract that dealt with operational consistency, financial oversight, and authorized supervision. The terms were precise, measured, and unambiguous. I read it slowly, allowing the reality to settle without resistance. I had been the one who understood the structure, so I recognized exactly what the loss of this lease meant. The warehouse had supported the business in every practical sense. It was where furniture arrived, where staging sets were stored, where delivery schedules were coordinated, and where clients viewed proposals before installation. Without the warehouse, the business had no physical anchor. The operation did not dissolve all at once, it simply lost its center. Without a center, everything else would eventually have to fall away or be rebuilt from the ground up. Later that day, a group call opened on my phone. I had not expected privacy, but I did expect repetition. My father spoke first with urgency that came from the realization of consequences rather than understanding. He insisted the termination was reversible, that all of this could be corrected if I would return to the role they had always assumed I would keep. He spoke as if stepping back into that space would undo everything, as if time and decisions could fold backward. My mother tried to soften the conversation, leaning on memories and familiar phrases about family and duty. She emphasized shared history, the sacrifices they believed they had made, the idea that stability came from staying together. But those words did not align with the choices they made when they placed expectations upon me without acknowledgment or reciprocity. The language of closeness sounded distant in the context we now stood in. Brooke's response came with a sharper tone. She spoke of betrayal and abandonment, insisting that I wanted to see the business fail to prove something about myself. She claimed I was seeking validation by stepping away, that everything unfolded because I desired attention. In her version of the story, she was the one who had been left carrying the weight. There was no mention of the decisions that led us to this point, only the consequences that she now felt. When I finally spoke, I did not offer explanations or counter-arguments. I gave a single clear statement that I was no longer part of the operation and could not return to a role built on imbalance. I explained that the lease termination followed from the operational decisions made in my absence and that I would comply fully with the transition requirements, including removal of inventory. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to persuade them. I had learned that clarity does not require volume. The silence that followed held everything that had been avoided for years. No one acknowledged their part. No one took responsibility. The call ended without agreement or resolution, much like every conversation that had led us here. Over the next several days, I began arranging the removal of the warehouse contents. I secured temporary storage scheduled transport and documented every piece of inventory. I completed each step deliberately without hesitation, but without hurry. The process was administrative, yet it carried a quiet sense of finality. When I walked through the warehouse during those final days, the space felt different. The echo of movement that once filled the rooms was gone, replaced by a kind of stillness that mirrored the shift inside me. The end had not arrived suddenly. It had been unfolding long before any of us acknowledged it. When the last item was loaded and the door was locked, I did not turn back to look at the building. The closing had already taken place long before that moment. The day of the warehouse clearing arrived with a quiet that felt deliberate rather than accidental. We met early in the morning not because anyone had coordinated thoughtfully, but because the situation required efficiency and there was nothing left to discuss. The building no longer held the movement and noise that once defined it. Each of us worked in separate sections of the warehouse, focusing on our tasks with a level of restraint that revealed more than any argument could have. There was no attempt to fill the silence with explanations or requests to reconsider. What remained between us had already been spoken in actions rather than conversations. I handled the inventory documentation one final time, confirming each piece before placement into the moving truck. My father loaded shelving units with the expression of someone trying to solve a problem without admitting it exists. My mother focused on fragile items, her movements careful and deliberate, though her eyes did not meet mine. Brooke moved in abrupt motions, avoiding proximity and letting unfinished emotions guide her pace. The absence of discussion did not come from peace. It came from recognition that every explanation would only lead back to the same truth the foundation had already broken long before the lease ended. When the final box was placed and the space stood empty, I walked to the entrance and removed my access card from my key ring. I placed it on the counter beside the building's visitor log. No one stepped forward to stop me. No one offered a final attempt at resolution. The lack of reaction clarified everything that had been uncertain before. I did not wait for acknowledgement or permission. I walked out into the parking lot and allowed the door to close behind me. The closure felt neither triumphant nor painful. It simply felt accurate. I drove away without looking back. The city felt familiar in a different way now, as if choosing myself had redrawn the shape of every street I passed. I was not returning to something new. I was beginning something I should have allowed myself much earlier. Sometimes the breaking point is not a moment of anger or confrontation, but the realization that continuing to carry the weight of a family's unspoken expectations comes at the cost of your own sense of self. I learned that loyalty without boundaries becomes surrender, and that love without respect becomes extraction. Choosing to walk away was not abandonment. It was an act of preservation and the first step toward rebuilding my life with intention and honesty. Thank you for listening to my story. Before I share the next chapter of my life, I would truly like to hear from you. Tell me what time you are watching and which city you are in now. It helps me understand how far this story has traveled and who it has reached. Your perspective matters here. Let me know your thoughts or simply where you are listening from.